Good morning. Today's lesson will be lesson 13. This will be the last lesson of this book, and the new ones are on the table. Yeah, the new ones are on the table back there, so be sure to grab one and be ready for next week. I think you said Brother Rick Hales has the first class of the new book, so. So this one has a pretty lengthy section of scripture associated with it, and then they ended up leaving off the last 3 or 4 verses of the chapter, which I thought, well, if you're going to put that much in there, you might as well finish it off. But so this one's on Solomon's fame. Of course, it comes from 2 Chronicles chapter 9, and I'll read the section of scripture here. It'll be quite lengthy, so bear with me. 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verses 1 through 28, and I'll actually finish it off from my version as well. Now when the Queen of Sheba heard the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with hard questions, having a very great retinue, camels that bore spices, gold in abundance, and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for Solomon that he could not explain to her. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers and their apparel, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. Then she said to the king, It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe their words until I came and saw with my own eyes, and indeed the half of the greatness of your wisdom was not told me. You exceed the fame of which I heard. Happy are your men, happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on his throne to be king for the Lord your God, because your God has loved Israel to establish them forever. Therefore he made you king over them, to do justice and righteousness. And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great abundance, and precious stones. There never were any spices such as those the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Also the servants of Hiram and the servants of Solomon, who brought gold from Ophir, brought algum wood and precious stones. And the king made walkways of the algum wood for the house of the Lord, and for the king's house, and also harps and stringed instruments for singers, and there were none such of these before in the land of Judah. Now King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, much more than she had brought to the king. So she turned and went to her own country, and she and her servants. The weight of the gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold, besides what the traveling merchants and traders brought, and all the kings of Arabia and governors of the country brought gold and silver to Solomon. And King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of hammered gold went into each shield. He also made 300 shields of hammered gold. 300 shekels of gold went into each shield. The king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. The throne had 6 steps with a footstool of gold, which were fastened to the throne. There were armrests on either side of the palace, of the place of the seat, and 2 lions stood beside the armrest. 12 lions stood there, one on each side of the 6 steps. Nothing like this had been made for any other kingdom. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold, and the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. No, not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. For the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram, once every 3 years, and merchant ships came, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. So King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. And all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Each man brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, armor, spices, horses, and mules at a set rate year by year. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots, and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king at Jerusalem. So he reigned over all the kings from the river to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedar trees as abundant as the sycamores, which are in the lowland. And they brought horses to Solomon from Egypt from all lands. So now I'll read the remaining 3 or 4 verses. And now the rest of the acts of Solomon from first to last, are they not written in the history of Nathan the prophet, and in the prophecy Elijah and Shalomonite, and in the visions of Iddo the seer concerning Jeroboam the son of Nebat? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years, and Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. So there's a lot of information in this chapter about just the sheer wealth and income that Solomon had. The fact that he essentially made silver worthless by the fact that he had so much of it, I guess, essentially flooded the market of silver. Whereas today, they could find more silver and it would just be that much better. It wouldn't drive the cost up, but it would still be sought after even more, because then there would be more on the market. Somebody would buy it up. And the same is here. Every time, kings or kingdoms found more treasures, they likely sent a portion of it, or if not all of a particular kind, to Solomon himself, just so they could be in his company, just like Queen Sheba was. So, there's a lot of opulence, if you will, just in this one chapter. And it's astounding at the sheer volume of it. But going back to verse 2, it says, So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for Solomon that he could not explain it to her. Again, this is the blessing of wisdom that Solomon received from God. And it goes on to say in verse 4, in the latter part, it says, there was no more spirit in her. And I read this as she was speechless. And I'm sure we all would be if we were being toured around some great kingdom and all we saw was gold, and the king had lions going up his walkway to his throne, basically, which is astounding in itself. The fact that he had lines, not only a couple of lines, but enough lines to basically make his own courtyard. So it's astounding the level of wealth and riches that Solomon had. And on the next page, or I don't even know what page this is. 130, sorry. I had too many notes in here. And the king made walkways of the algum wood in the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and also harps, stringed instruments, and for singers, and there were none such as these before in the land of Judah. So he made a quality of instrument that was nothing like anyone else had seen, because of the caliber of materials that he had. Even today, there's only certain materials used for instruments and various other prized possessions like that you wouldn't just use yellow pine to make a violin or something like that. You would want to use a specific wood that's been curated and treated and grown in the proper environments, because it matters. It produces a different sound. But just the fact that Solomon had access to any and everything that he would want, as far as that goes, is astounding in itself. And then the sheer amount of gold that he was getting on a yearly basis. Verse 13, the weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. And that's not to count what the traveling merchants and traders brought. So that's how I'm understanding it, at least. But just in today's terms, unless, just by my own crude calculations, that's about $1.2 billion a year that he's getting in gold alone. And not to mention all the other prized possessions, the animals and the other rare stones and spices and other rare commodities that he's having brought into him just because he's King Solomon. And then King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold, 600 shields or shekels of hammered gold went into each shield. He also made 300 shields of hammered gold, 300 shekels of gold went into each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. So again, he had so much gold and so much, time because he was so wealthy that he was able to allow his people to make ornamental armaments. And because you're not going to use gold in battle, it's too brittle, or it's too soft, rather. So it's just astounding the amount of gold and the amount of wealth that he had. And then we see in the next verse, 17, the king made a great throne of ivory, and then he overlaid it with gold. So ivory in itself is, a commodity. Solomon had so much abundance that he was able to do what we would consider frivolous things with the precious metals and the precious artifacts and whatnot. But again, what else was he going to do with it? If he kept it in a storehouse, nobody would be able to see it, and he wouldn't be able to parade people around and say, "Look at this." The throne had 6 steps with a footstool of gold, which were fastened to the throne. There were armrests on either side at the place of the seat, and 2 lines stood beside the armrest. And again, he's got the 2 lines there, and he's got 12 lines going up to the 6 steps that are going up to the throne. And it's unreal, the amount of wealth and, again, the word opulence that is seen here. And then, of course, not one of the drinking vessels were made of silver, because why would you? I mean, he's got all of this gold. He's going to do something with it, and essentially made silver worthless, as we see later on in the chapter here. But even throughout history, except for this period of time, undoubtedly, that silver is extremely valuable. It's extremely valuable today. It's in jewelry, it's in electronics, and because of its unique properties. But it is considered a rare metal because that's what kind of works into its value, if you will. But here, it was not rare. It was so abundant that it was worthless. It was like any other stones, as it said in Jerusalem. So it's still. I'm just astounded at the amount of wealth and treasure that Solomon had. So going on to the introduction here, in the second to the last paragraph, Solomon was known throughout Israel for wise judgment for the people. For the people saw the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice, but his fame did not stop at the borders of the nation. So kings from all around were coming to have court with Solomon, and they were bringing these treasures of their own to add to his stock, and they were able to commune with him and have his wisdom imparted upon them. And in the next chapter there says, although Solomon's wisdom drew great crowds, this was not the reason he was known. According to 1 Kings 10:23, he also surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches. Providing a glimpse of his wealth, Scripture states, all King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold, and all the vessels in the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. And I think it's also interesting that all the vessels of the house of forest of Lebanon were pure gold, not covered in gold, but they were pure gold. A lot of times you'll see items like this that are gold plated. And that's not what was happening here. It's pure gold. And it just goes to show, he asked God for wisdom. He didn't ask him for riches, and God gave him wisdom and riches. So the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedar trees as abundant as the sycamores, which are in the lowland. Now, I don't know anything about the geographical constraints of growing cedar trees in that part of the world, but I'm assuming it's fairly difficult and not quite as abundant as a growing tree there as the sycamores were. But undoubtedly it was considered a valuable piece of wood. I mean, there are numerous uses for cedar. You can use it for, closets to keep the moss away and stuff like that. And that's, it's good as far as bug repellents in some instances or some variations of it.
It seems that they got most of their cedar from Lebanon, right?
Yeah.
Of the coast.
Okay.
That's part of King Hiram's arrangement, right? With the first of David and then with Solomon.
Right. So going on here, it says, with that being said, Solomon's greatest achievement was not his fame, which continues even today. It is a simple statement that he provides at the end of Ecclesiastes, concluding that life apart from God is meaningless. He wrote, "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." So Solomon had all the riches that anyone could imagine, but it didn't exclude him from the judgment of God. He was still going to be put in the same category with everybody else at the judgment day, and he's not going to have a separate, he had this level of wealth, so he's in this section over here, he'll be judged differently. That's not how it works for anybody, even today. We're all judged the same and according to the same metrics, and but at the same time, Solomon had much more expected of him because of his level of wealth. And we'll see that later on as well. One of the individuals who heard the fame of Solomon was the Queen of Sheba. To investigate the matter for herself, she came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with hard questions. And it's when you think of somebody nowadays, you don't think of somebody being famous for their wisdom. Because there's very little entertainment value in wisdom these days.
It's not highly valued.
Exactly, yeah. So it's kind of hard to understand how someone that was as wise as they were was, that's what drew people to him, was his wisdom. And yeah, he was super rich and richer than anyone else alive or whatever, or had been up to that point. But at the same time, that was secondary. That was in the shadow of his wisdom because his wisdom was so great. And then it says, regardless, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for Solomon that he could not explain it to her. So, again, that would be an astounding blessing to have for yourself, is, to be able to answer all questions in all situations with the right process to take, and it would, if I had that, I wouldn't be in as much trouble as a husband as I am typically.
Well, he had it, but it didn't.
Yeah, well,
But it didn't do
he was wise, but how many wives did he have? I mean, and concubines, and
Was it 1,000 all put together?
yeah, something like that. It's just amazing that someone, looking at it from today's perspective, you're not going to value, like you said, you're not going to value someone just because they're wise. They're not going to have, people following them around, taking their pictures and putting them on websites and papers and TV shows and whatever else, there's no money in it, essentially. But here Solomon was, people were coming to him and actively giving him large swaths of treasure just to spend time with him and to ask him questions and discuss things with him. And Sheba was in no doubt wise in her own right, just because of her level of, or her status in life. She was Queen Sheba, but nothing she could ask was going to be able to stump him. So again, the astounding level of wisdom that Solomon had, he was able to have people from all around come up to him and discuss things with him, and he was able to impart wisdom upon it. Whereas, there might be someone that's locally wise, as in, well, this is how it's typically handled in this area of the country or this area of Alabama or whatever, and you might get some information that way, but you're not going to go to New York and say, how do I handle this situation down in Hoover, Alabama, where this is going on? Well, they don't know the culture down here. So it's amazing that all the little nuances of understanding was a part of Solomon's blessing that he had. Complimenting Solomon, the Queen of Sheba declared, "Happy are your men, happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom." The statement was made to praise Solomon's treatment of others instead was not made to praise Solomon's treatment of others. Instead, it was designed to indicate how blessed others were to regularly be in the presence of one as wise as Solomon, an opportunity she experienced for only a short time. So again, it goes to, I think Solomon kind of understood the level of blessing that he had and wanted to not take advantage of it and not mistreat those people around him, because he likely knew that and understood that it could easily be taken away if he was to misuse it and mistreat others. And so she understood that Solomon's wisdom was unusual. Therefore, she attributed it to God and thus praised him by saying, "Blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you, setting you on his throne to be king for the Lord your God, because your God has loved Israel to establish them forever. Therefore, he has made you king over them to do justice and righteousness." So again, I think Solomon understood his purpose there was to do justice and righteousness, as she stated. And the queen reasoned that if Solomon was divinely endowed, his God was certainly worthy of praise. So Solomon was essentially an outlet for God to be seen, his works to be seen, and people recognized it undoubtedly. I'm sure that Sheba was not the only other individual that took counsel with Solomon to recognize that. But again, Solomon was blessed in so many ways, and we should live our lives in a way or in a manner that amplifies what God has given to us. Be the light to others in the world around us. And we should, not shy away from the fact that God has blessed us. Not that we should boast about it, but we should still embrace it, and when we have the opportunity, bless others with what God has blessed us with. But I think that's sort of an ancillary takeaway from the overall chapter as well. So on page 136, it says, "The remainder of our lesson text catalogs the magnificent wealth of King Solomon. Every year a tribute from surrounding nations flowed into Israel. The amount of gold collected was an immense 666 talents. This does not include what was traveling merchants brought and traders brought. Kings and governors from across the world also brought gold and silver to Solomon." Now, I was kind of curious, if somebody was to show up with a big cartload of silver, if Solomon would be like, more silver? I don't have any use for this. But at the same time, surely he was humble enough to understand that sometimes that's all places had was silver as part of their treasure. But I still, thought about that for a little bit, and was curious as to whether or not Solomon really saw value in silver, or if it was, like he said, it was just like stones in Jerusalem. Not much to do with it because he had all the gold and everything else that he was using to create vessels with and shields with. And yeah, maybe so. That's what the underlings get, was the silver items. But even still, it's still amazing just the sheer volume of wealth and the fact that silver is even as valuable as it is today. And in some points in history, silver has been more valuable than gold, depending on the supply and demand of it. But here, it was not at all the case. Gold was much more valuable and appealing nonetheless because it was used for all the showpieces. Yes, sir. So I kind of looked that up a little bit, but then I decided to not look it up anymore. But I think I saw something where a shekel was worth about $5. So I think I looked it up, and it said that each of those, or all the large shields were worth like $55 million, and all the smaller shields that he built were worth like $30-something million. So even if that's a gross undervaluement of it, it's still astounding, the fact that he had all that extra that he was able to just build frivolous, display armaments with.
In the numeric on verse 13, we speak of the numeric standard, 666 talents of gold each year. And the footnote says about 25 tons.
Yeah.
Or 23 metric tons. So I mean, just imagine 25 tons of gold each year.
Yeah. I can barely fathom a pound of gold, much less tons. I had looked it up, and I was hoping I could find it quickly, but let's see, this might be it. So yeah, just the sheer amount that he had. And so this is using 2016 prices, so it's fairly old. But one commentator sets the value of the 666 talents of gold at, let me read the commas, $281 million, according to 2016 prices. So he was getting that just in gold every year. Not to mention, like it said, the traders and merchants. And then, let's see if I can find the shield part. Let's see. This is according to someone else's calculations, each large shield was worth about $120,000. The small shields were worth $30,000. $33 million was invested in gold ceremonial shields, and the larger shields were worth $152,000, and the smaller shields were worth $76,000. So if you can imagine carrying around a shield that's worth more than, some people's houses around here. I mean, it's insane, the amount of opulence that was available and on display here. And it goes on to talk about not one with silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the day of Solomon. If taken seriously, it shows a tremendous abundance of Solomon's kingdom, and that's absolutely true. Even if it's a flippant statement and there was some value, it was not anywhere near the value of gold. So undoubtedly, it was very much undervalued in today's terms. Yeah. Yeah, it was definitely meant to be the centerpiece. It was made of ivory and overlaid with gold and had lines, going up and down the steps and right next to the throne itself. It's awe-inspiring and intended to be awe-inspiring.
I think that's as much as anything. Only the kings in that whole region, and this is part of this 666, 25 tons, right?
Yeah,
But they're paying tribute to him, to keep him from attacking them or whatever.
you're right.
He's got this kind of relationship with them all. And so part of it's kind of awe-inspiring if they are able to come and see this great king, you have to approach this throne, and he's sitting up high up, right on
Yeah,
the platform with, gold, gleaming gold and so on. And no doubt, he performed, she spoke about the Queen of Sheba, the apparel,
mm-hmm.
and all of his servants, his guards and all that. It was all part of the image.
Yeah, and undoubtedly, Solomon, I don't think it was an afterthought that he was taking care of his servants and his people, because when you're in that kind of position, you don't want to mistreat them because they're the one bringing your food, they're the one, checking on you at night when you're asleep and defenseless.
Taster.
Yeah, your tasters, and so I think that alone was kind of evident of not only was he blessed, but he was so blessed that he could take care of these people at a level that other people had not seen for kings and queen or royal subjects or whatever.
One interesting aspect of this for me is that back in Deuteronomy 17, it's where the instruction, I guess, from God through Moses, that when they came into the land, there was this, you will be appointed a king, and so on, and they gave instructions about the king. God did. And there were basically three prohibitions for the king, and that was accumulating numerous wives, many horses, and silver and gold.
Yeah,
One thing I guess is all right, is God made the exception, obviously.
right.
And you alluded to it a while ago, because of Solomon's humility in asking for wisdom, even wisdom in asking for wisdom.
Yeah,
He got all this, and I think there's one lesson for all of us is, he didn't even ask for it, but he got it, but, it didn't serve him too well, did it?
yeah,
And even in Ecclesiastes, it's like, I did all this, I had all this, everything in the world that I could imagine,
mm-hmm.
I had available to me, and it left me empty in a way, right?
Right.
That's basically what he was saying.
So I'm sorry, you had to. So a lot of misunderstanding around that number. There's been a lot of teaching as far as I think the Book of Revelation that they try to put more weight on it than what there actually is. Some people see it as a strictly evil number, and that's the mark of the beast or whatever. But there's really no backing for that. It's just more of that's what somebody came up with, and they've been teaching it. And even today, people want something visual that they can see, that they can recognize. Well, I want to be able to recognize when the Antichrist, as they would use it in that sense, would come. But Antichrist is not one particular thing, it's a lot of things. And it's not a sign of the end of the times, so to speak. It's just there's Christ and there's Antichrist. And we're supposed to be like Christ. And those that are like an Antichrist, not really an individual, but just a way of living or going against what Christ would teach, more or less. So, but I think there's too much significance put on it, and there's not really anything to back it up as far as is teaching in the Bible that says we're supposed to stay away from, significant instances of that number. Working in a grocery store, I saw it so many times. People would go through the line, they'd buy a candy bar, or drink, and something else, and your total is $6.66. Well, let me get something else. It don't matter, The hellfire is not going to come up to the floor and take you down with it. That's not what's going to happen. And it used to crack me up. I would go, I think it was Taco Bell when I was in college. I would go there and I would get the same thing every time, and each time it would be $6.66. And it would you just see the fear in the person's eyes. You sure you don't want something else? No, I'm fine. I don't. It's just a number, dude. That's what I would tell them. I was like, it's just a number. Yeah. Should have embraced it and really messed with them, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of emphasis put on that, and also on the inverse, the number 777. People see that and they see that as a good number or holy number or whatever. But again, we don't really have any teaching on that tells us to avoid or embrace certain numbers or things like that. But yeah. Undoubtedly. But at the same time, how can you count all that? I mean, you'd have to have scores of people just that did nothing but count the stuff that came in, because it's just so abundant. And then to put some kind of value on it and keep track of it. It's unreal. So let's look at the applications here. Jesus referred to the Queen of Sheba's visit with Solomon to make a point with the people of his day. As great as Solomon was, Jesus was greater. Consequently, our Lord said, the Queen of the South will rise up in judgment with the generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. And then the next one, number 2, says, the wealth of Solomon accumulated is staggering. Nevertheless, he realized that life's meaning was not found in one's net worth. Making this point, Solomon wrote, then I hated all of my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be able to be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all of my labor, in which I toiled and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Solomon's assessment is worthy of consideration, especially when we note that his wealth was left to his son Rehoboam, who lost it all. So this gives truth to the saying, easy come, easy go, as far as that's concerned. But at the same time, we're also taught in Matthew 6:19 through 21. Let's look at that real quick. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with this passage. It says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So earthly wealth and treasure can be lost as quick or quicker than it took to obtain it. And we should make sure that our heart is in the right place. So we shouldn't focus so much on the treasures here on earth, but focus on the treasures in heaven, or the treasure of heaven. So, and again, I think the case can be made that if we're blessed by God with certain aspects of our life, I think we have a responsibility to in turn bless others that are not as close to God as we are, or don't even know God in any sense. And in that way, we can use that as a teaching method to get our foot in the door, so to speak. Because people will notice, if you're being generous when you yourself are not at the same level as the rich, But just to, Any other closing comments or questions? We're out of time, so. Be sure to pick up the new books on the back table back there, and Brother Rick Hale will start us off next week. Thank you for your attention.